Block, Walter Brueggemann, and John McKnight for an intimate conversation about their latest book, Another Kingdom. We've invited these men to join us to discover what has inspired them to co-author this book and explore the proposed paradigm shift that they outline for a new economy and a new way of being together. My name is Sylvia Chu. I'm the Director of Deepening Community at Tamarack, and I'm delighted to be moderating the webinar. In this newest book, John, Peter, and Walter explore how our seduction into beliefs in competition, scarcity, and acquisition is causing an erosion in our communities, our neighborhoods, and our relationships. Another Kingdom provides a new narrative, an invitation to shift our thinking and speaking, and to take us out of a culture of addictive consumption into a place where contract is replaced by covenant, consumption is replaced by neighborliness, and our time is reclaimed as our own. So let me introduce you to our three guests. John McKnight is the founder and co-director of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, whose graduates, including both Michelle and Barack Obama, continue to have an impact strengthening communities and neighborhoods around the world. In 2013, John was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Waterloo in recognition for his innovative work. For 3 decades, he has researched social service delivery systems, health policy, community organizations, and neighborhood policy. He's the author of Careless Society and the co-author of Building Communities from the Inside Out and The Abundant Community. John serves on the board of several national organizations that support neighborhood development, and he remains tireless in his recognition and championing citizens and their capacity to care for one another. Peter Block is an author and citizen of Cincinnati, Ohio. He's a partner in Designed Learning, a training company that offers workshops designed to build the skills outlined in his books. He's the author of Flawless Consulting, Stewardship, The Answer to How is Yes, Community, the Structure of Belonging, and The Abundant Community, which he co-authored with John McKnight. Peter serves on the board of Elements, an urban arts center, and Live Person, a provider of online engagement solutions. His work is in the restoration of communities and creating a world that reclaims our humanity from the onslaught of modernism. And finally, Walter Brueggemann is the William Marcellus McPheeters Professor Emeritus of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. He's the past president of the Society of Biblical Literature, and he is also an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. He has recently written Disruptive Grace, a book that is, and a second book entitled David and His Theologian. We are so fortunate to be working very closely with John and Peter and have for some time, and welcome this opportunity to get to know Walter a bit better. So welcome all three of you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'd like to open up our conversation by asking the three of you to talk to us a little bit about who each of you are, kind of how you came to know one another, and what inspired you to write this new book together.
Well, this is Peter. I'll start. So the last 15 years, I've been trying to figure out how to support the idea of a restorative community, the old civil rights language of beloved community. Lately I've been involved in saying, well, if we want to really have an impact on the world, we have to do something about creating an alternative economic belief system. And a lot of that was inspired by the focus on economics by Walter's discussion of the Old Testament and Egypt and the Jews' slavery there, and really their trek into the wilderness in some ways was into an alternative economy away from slavery. One of the things Walter said was that the Jews were enslaved for 400 years, most of that time due to lack of imagination. They couldn't imagine a world other than the one they were inhabiting. And so I feel that's true for the consumer world. We can't imagine a world where we have enough, where neighborliness kind of trumps consumption. I think this book began with Walter reading Abundant Community and writing an article about it. And my most vivid memory is John and I were listening to big band music in Cincinnati and somebody called us and read us Walter's argument and Walter's article. And John and I were thrilled to see it. And then we found out that Walter had spent his life in Old Testament and lived in Cincinnati, and so we became friends. People started inviting us to speak together, to combine kind of faith community with community. And then we decided, I asked the question, would you guys like to write a book? And they said yes, so we sat down and spoke a book into being. And then it was just a matter of giving order to it. But both John and Walter have probably been among the greatest inspiration for my thinking in a long, long time. So it's just wonderful to be in their presence.
That's beautiful. John, Walter, anything else that you can share about what you were, what excited you about working on this collaborative writing together, and what the experience of creating it?
This is John. I think one of the things that emerged by our talking with each other about what we understood was that most people who are looking for something different than the current way think about programs or projects or policies, that's 3 Ps, and it seemed to me in our discussions what was clear was that there was another way of thinking about the future would not necessarily be reached by policies, programs, etc. And that is to understand that what we're dealing with is a question of culture, a people's way. And so it was wonderful for me to be with Walter and Peter, who are themselves people with a great and deep understanding of the meaning and impact of culture in shaping how we behave and shape the world.
It really, what you've said really resonates, because as you say, if we offer programs, policies, or projects but haven't actually changed our fundamental way of thinking, we are not likely to get to the kind of alternative future that you are proposing is possible and reminding us of. Walter, what really drew you to working with these 2 colleagues of yours?
Well, they represent awarenesses and disciplines that are quite other than my own, and they have opened up a whole new world of awareness for me, and I am endlessly stimulated and educated by my interaction with them. My own propulsion about all of this is out of my own study. I am increasingly convinced that our society is very much on a self-destructive path, and that so much of our policy formation is contained in an ideology that is remote from social reality. And I think that the articulation of a path for life that is not shaped by the ideology of commoditization is really a very urgent task. And I have found these 2 really good companions to try to keep working at that. So it's a combination of what has arisen from my own writing and research and to find people that are so alert and deeply informed about the work that we have to do.
That's beautiful. One of the things that's interesting is that Another Kingdom is full of references to the Bible and to notions of community and neighborliness in biblical times. But at the same time, we're all aware that for the last several centuries there's been a really an increasing sort of division between the roles of church and state. So can you say a little bit more about about sort of the role of religion and or these parables that you're sharing as part of your outlining of a new paradigm?
Yeah. Well, the way I understand it, it's a matter of competing meta-narratives, and it's oversimple to say that the great competition is between the narrative of that the market is all containing and a narrative of human covenantedness that has its rootage in the biblical tradition. So I think it's not a matter of religion being a distinct sphere. It is a question whether a trustworthy religious tradition can generate a meta-narrative that can be compelling and empowering as distinct from the dominant narrative that largely remains uncritical among us. And so I do not want my religious tradition or my own work to be slotted in the sphere of religion. I think that's a misreading of the biblical tradition, and my own vocation is to try to help people get over the misreading of the Bible that I think has largely been captured by the meta-narrative of the market.
So again, you're sort of bringing us and encouraging us to view a lot of this framing from a much broader place, to really encourage us all to question the dominant culture. And if I can ask, your book really does do a good job of outlining the 4 pillars of the free market ideology, and then very intentionally proposing an alternate paradigm that's really based on the neighborly covenant. And I love the language, I have to say. Can you tell us a bit more about the framing of the free market for those of us who may not have read the book yet, and then also contrast it by some of the elements that you've highlighted in the neighborly covenant and how we would create a culture of neighborliness?
Well, I think that the principal claim of market ideology is that life consists in the accumulation of commodities. So it's propelled by consumerism, and it's sustained by militarism and by the assumption that there are technological solutions to every problem. And what that does in sum, as we are witnessing every day, it excludes people from social participation who do not have wealth and technical competence. And you can't build a neighborhood that way. So I think that the biblical tradition, alongside some other traditions, really believes that face-to-face relationships that are grounded in trust and that are practiced in generosity and fidelity constitute a wholesale contradiction to market ideology, because in market ideology there can be no neighbors. Everyone is a threat or a rival or a competitor. So what an alternative narrative needs to do is to recharacterize the people that are in front of us as neighbors. And then that evokes a whole different set of practices that are not possible as long as the people in front of us are not neighbors but are rivals.
So, Christy, let me just respond quickly. If they haven't read the book, is the free market consumer ideology, first of all, believes in scarcity, that there's not enough. It believes that development is good. It considers if you don't develop a piece of property, you've rendered that property useless. So the land now is useless unless we've built upon it. It also believes in certainty and perfection. We've privatized everything. We think that the common good, so what Walter and John have represented forever, as a return to the commons and the common good. And I asked Walter what the Jews found in the wilderness, and he said neighborliness. And so, in a sense, the Exodus is from consumption to treating each other as neighbors. And John, maybe you could talk a little bit about, but in the consumer world, we have to label each other. We need to categorize each other in order to know how to serve and sell each other. And so, in my mind, there's no such thing as a homeless person. There are people that don't know where they're sleeping at night. But as soon as you call somebody homeless, you have a very narrow market version of who that person is.
Yeah. Yes, when you think about people who we identify by what is wrong with them, about those as labeled people, might be people who are labeled with developmental disabilities or mental illness or a particular race or ethnic identity, or it could be women. All of those categories are ways of saying about somebody, number one, you're deficient, and number two, if you look to the market, you may find a way to deal with your deficiency. Now, the human service system is one part of the market that is designed to lead one to believe that if you accept the label, then the way you get dealt with and live a better life is to become a part of the market of the health and human service world. So when we're talking about market, I think it's also important to recognize that we're not just talking about the typical commerce of corporations and grocery stores and that kind of thing. We're talking also about, the biggest sector in our society, which has to do with services and has to do with provision of sickness care. So the transformation that we're talking about is one that depends on our understanding how much of the society is really surrounded by institutions that claim that they can fix you or they can improve you. And in that claim, what they deny is the fact that in your community, that is where the relationships can lead you to wholeness. So there is this contrast between the market understood very broadly and the community understood as the other way.
But what I really love about how you've written this is you are bringing us back to saying, to unpacking each one of those alternative ideologies and helping us to perhaps see a pathway and have a deeper appreciation for the kinds of shifts and changes that we have to commit to, starting first with how we think about things if we want to be part of building an alternate future. One of the things that I was particularly struck by, and as I looked through your book, was your thinking and writing about the disciplines of neighborliness. And, you talk about that and also speak about what you call covenantal promises to sustain the common good, which you've identified as time, food, and silence. Can you each talk a little bit more about how one would embrace those disciplines of neighborliness? What would that look like in terms of how I might change how I spend my days or the intention I bring to that?
I could start by saying the first thing you would do is never leave a meeting with a list. So the idea that we could be together and not be productive is such a radical thought. And so really time is a constant. We think we're busy. And so most of us think we come together to do something, when in a covenantal world we come together to discover each other. And so you replace problem solving with curiosity. And so much of the covenantal work or the neighborly work is to discover who we are, and then if there's something to do, we'll do that in the last 5 minutes as we're walking out the door. So it's really an assault on the notion of what's useful, what's valuable. And it's not you want to be unproductive, it's just that if we get connected, and there's all kinds of research behind that, if we get connected, then what we do takes on a whole different quality. And unconnected people produce unuseful outcomes. And so time, there's time for everything. Rather than
time is,
we think busy. Yeah, go ahead.
I think time is the hallmark. It's an interesting question to ask what we actually do with our time. I can remember, I'm old enough that I can remember that the first time I ever saw a television set, I was 26 years old. And it was another 20 years before I saw the screen of a computer, right? And so one of the things that this has led me to think about is, because I spend part of my life looking at a television screen, looking at a computer screen, I asked myself, what did I do for the first 26 years of my life when I didn't have screens?
You wasted it.
Yeah, that's right. I wasted my time because I was not productive in the market as I am now with my time. So it is a way of understanding the possibility just in many people's lives to ask, if you thought you didn't have all of the market goods that claim to make your life better, what would you do with your life? And I think almost anybody who's as old as I who thinks back at that time is what you did was you spent time with other people face to face. And the reasons that my colleague Bob Putnam in Bowling Alone as for the decline in people being together in connection and association, he believes it is a direct result of replacing time together with time in front of a screen.
I've got a question, Walter. Walter, you talk about reperformance a lot.
About what?
Reperformance, sacred reperformance.
Yeah.
I think it's a powerful idea, because part of what I've gotten from you, Walter, is you overcame my amnesia. Being a modern person, I kind of had lost any sense of memory. And in the modern world, what's new is everybody's question. And what you do with the Old Testament is, and so maybe you could share a little bit, because I think your notion of reperformance is a very powerful idea.
Well, I think that the Bible is one example of a trusted communal script, and what the community does that gathers around it is that it continues to reperform that narrative. So if you think about the Passover, for example, it is the reperformance of the Exodus narrative. If you think about the Christian Eucharist, it is the reperformance of the Last Supper. And most families at the really important festival times, they are reperforming ancient memories and ancient scripts. And I think communities live by the reperformance of those scripts, whereas market ideology wants to dispose of all old scripts and keep generating newness, new ones that have no rootage. And the reperformance of old scripts then requires a very active, generative, imaginative kind of memory to keep old scripts contemporary. And it is that practice of imagination upon which human community depends. And I think that in market ideology, the great enemy of imagination is technology, in which you don't have to imagine anything, you just fix everything. So I want to set that antithesis up quite as sharply as I can.
You know, when you mention this, I've never heard the term sacred reperformance before, but what it really evoked for me is also remembering that there used to be much more noticeably rituals or rites of passage that were kind of shared and understood. I mean, when and they're not, to my mind, as common. And is that part of that? Is that part of the same dynamic that we're disconnected as individuals from seeing sort of our path and our evolution?
Well, I think that's exactly right. I think that much human life, viable human life that is generative for people, depends upon reiteration of tradition that is done in imaginative forms. So you can't repeat the tradition. You have to reperform it with imagination, and I think that's what we always do at our best. My notion of reperformance is informed by classical music. That if you go to classical music, you have a pretty defined working repertoire of Bach and Brahms and Beethoven, but you go to the concert because every time they are reperformed differently. So reperformance requires knowing the score, but it also requires great energetic imagination to reperform it, to make it a quite contemporary offer. And I think that's what families and communities of meaning are always doing, and the reperformance of rites of passage is certainly one example of that.
This reperformance. Go ahead.
Go ahead, John. Go ahead, John.
This idea of reperformance is so powerful, Walter. In a way, reperformance is embodied in a story. It's the story of the Last Supper. It's the story of the Passover. It's the story that gives a history and a connectivity between people, and I think it's almost necessary for people to have a story if they're to have a community that is going to be life-sustaining. But what I think has happened to many of us is that we've been uprooted. Our story has been torn away from us. And so we have to look for someone else's story. We're story inundated by media that says, well, here's a story that we have for you. But real communities say, no, it's not your story, it's our story. And our story has grown out of our mutual commitment to each other through time.
Christy, there's a question. Paul Dart has asked a question on the chat, and I think it's a beautiful question. He says, we're talking about transition towards relationships, communication. He said many of these are mediated online. He said, what do they think of the sharing economy that's now so much in front of us, people sharing kitchen drives? So I think it's a great question, because I think technology is useful, just like the telephone is interesting. And it does put us in touch with things. It doesn't connect us. I know where you are. I don't know who you are. And the sharing economy, I think there is some that's genuinely community building, like maker spaces, co-housing, things but what Uber does and what a lot of the online things do is they just say, look, you have excess marketing capacity, why don't you utilize it? You have an extra room, rent it. You have you need ride in each other's car. You can take advantage of driving by getting somebody to pay you with your own car. So I think that if sharing is sharing for the sake of itself, and the neighborliness and reperformance we're talking about, that makes sense. But a lot of it, as soon as it goes online and take it to scale, then it just becomes a more sophisticated form of marketing to each other in the name of neighborliness. And anyway, thanks, Paul, for the question.
I think what really struck me, Peter, as you were responding to the question, was you really highlighted for me a bit of a paradox, right? Because of the power of the internet, we are able to connect with one another in completely new ways, and the catalyst is often, you know, a consumable that we need, or that we're, you know, trying to find an alternate way to access without having to buy, which is beautiful. And the output, one of the unexpected and beautiful outputs of the sharing economy, is the relationships that get created as a result. So, you know, it feels like a beautiful paradox, really, because by chance, or in this innovative new way, we are actually returning to this sense of caring for one another, of knowing one another, and helping one another. Though I'm not sure that that's always the impetus why.
I think once we know each other, the online is a great way of staying in touch. The other, you know, but anyway, thank you for the thoughts.
Are there, Christy, are there other questions that are bubbling in the box that maybe we can invite forward?
We do have lots of questions coming in. Thank you so much, everyone. And I also just wanted to let everyone know, based on John and Peter and Walter's request earlier, that we do have people from Ontario, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, North Carolina, Michigan, California, Wisconsin, Ohio, and South Africa on the line with us today. So thank you all for these great questions. We have a question from William Roberts. I have just returned from Ramallah and learning with the Palestinians in their land occupied by 50 years of Israeli military occupation. Walter has engaged with these current realities, and I would like at some point to bridge this thinking about another kingdom to their reality. Or is this book only intended for neoliberal North American realities and communities? Wondering if you can comment on that.
Well, I think obviously the target of our book is our North American economy. Undoubtedly, that's the frame in which we were doing most of our thinking. But the Palestinian issue, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, is the same. That until Palestinians and Israelis are able to perceive the other as a neighbor and are able to develop policies that enhance and serve neighborliness, it will continue to be a violent repetition. And I've written a little book about that because I think that the market ideology has been largely captured by Zionism. And that means that Palestinians are denied any viable way of living. So it would take some tweaking, but I think that our argument is readily transferable to that situation or to any other situation, precisely because the human requirements keep surfacing everywhere, and Israeli land policy is obviously based on the notion of scarcity, that the land cannot be shared because there's not enough to share, or water cannot be shared, and these all fly in the face of the political facts on the ground. So I don't think it would be very problematic to set that crisis down in the middle of our argument as well.
Also, I would just add that, you know, the market has prided itself on globalization. And in my mind, globalization is a nice word for economic imperialism and the exporting of the market culture. And so it's hard to go anywhere in the world now without feeling its tentacles. And so, you know, it takes different forms, but it's really questioning what he calls the neoliberal kind of movement that we've been a part of for 30 years at least.
Any other questions showing up for us, Christy?
Oh, we're getting lots. This is great. So we have a message, question from Bonnie Ratner, who's from Portland, or formerly, I'm going to say this wrong, Tuolumne County in Sacramento. Says, hi, John. I wonder if you've met before. Bonnie asks, what do we do with the parts of the old scripts that seem anti-ethical to neighborliness? I don't wish to simplify your argument, and I'm drawn to the idea of a new paradigm that reduces the role of the market. But the old scripts are often exclusionary and vengeful. She says, this is a great conversation. Thank you.
You know, sociologists have, I think, a great insight. They say that the one thing that is true of all communities is that they create outsiders by their very definition. You could be a group of people who come together because you're interested in a particular breed of dogs. But that, by its very nature, leads to all other people who are interested in other breeds not being a ready member of the group. So that, in that sense, we do have to recognize that our stories and our tribalism has a dark side, and if we can create circles, right, that then create outsiders, that's the real danger. And it isn't a problem that we would create a group with a common purpose, goal, or value. The problem is, how do we view people on the edge? And there, I think the issue is that we are always welcoming, that hospitality is the abiding value in our relationships individually and in our relationships collectively. So one of the ways of knowing, I think, that we've moved into another kingdom is that our lives are a manifestation of the idea of hospitality. And I think hospitality goes two ways. It is a way of sharing, and sharing outside the boundary, welcoming the stranger.
I think I really appreciate the question, because it really kind of helps highlight a way in which sometimes in our embracing of culture we unintentionally can create other, and you're inviting us to that mindfulness. And you know, the emphasis on hospitality, I think, so simple, it's easy to overlook, but it's so critical. Christy, other questions?
Yes, there are some great questions coming in. I'm just going to, here we go. It's a question from Lisa Hong, and it sort of is related to the last question. She asks, I wonder if you are assuming that the Old Testament is a story that is a history we all identify with, belong to. What about indigenous peoples and people of other faiths? How do we find stories that we can rest in together?
Well, I think we have to listen to each other's stories, and as best we can, we cannot be imperialistic to try to impose our best narrative on anybody else. And what happens when I listen to someone else recite their story, in the listening process, my story becomes nuanced differently, and therefore bearing witness to our stories in each other's presence is not an argument, it's not a contest, but it is a matter of giving gifts to each other so that my hearing of someone else's story enables me to read and hear and tell my story differently. So I think that the Old Testament story, for example, has to stand alongside many other stories, not in a domineering position, but as a part of a dialogical enterprise. And when we engage in that dialogical enterprise, all of our stories are enriched, and all of them become more porous in terms of receiving gifts that other stories want to give. But the problem with most of our serious stories is that we've regarded them in monopolistic kinds of ways, that if I entertain this story, I cannot possibly credit any other story than that. And obviously, that's a misunderstanding of the generative power of pluralism, so that I have to hold my story in the presence of other stories that may be told with equal conviction.
You know, I think
it helps. Yeah. Go ahead, John.
Canada has a wonderful history. In the United States, to me, we have the idea that somebody who is a foreigner, an outsider, is somebody who needs to take Americanization classes. We see the melting pot. And it's, in a way, that says, give up your old story, we've got a new story. And that has some very positive advantages. But I notice in Canada that for a long time, they would talk about their national goal being to have a mosaic in which every story side by side makes the beautiful picture together. So it isn't the problem of the story. The story itself is an asset. It is what your view of the boundary of the story's meaning is, and how much you say it is an absolute truth as a story. It's our story, and together with their story, when we hear all our stories, we become a trusting community. So it's that synthesis of story that I think is just beautiful. Don't we all enjoy going to a place that has another culture, another story, and aren't we amazed by what we learn and experience and feel when we see the other story? So it is reasonable to have a mosaic in society.
Also, I would say that the story is something that we construct, it's a social construction. So even though I have a story, take my identity from a story, it's still something, in a sense, I made up to give meaning to my own trail, to my own history. I know I asked Walter once, part of this question was, what about all the violence and everything in the Old Testament? And I said to Walter, what about Cain and Abel? That was kind of not very neighborly. And Walter's response, he says, well, even God is in recovery from that mistake.
All the talk of story reminds me of, I think it's a line from a poem written by Meg Wheatley, where she reminds us that we never fear someone whose story we know.
That's right.
And, for me, that ties in so beautifully with this notion of hospitality and slowing down and time and listening with curiosity and the possibilities that creates just by choosing to engage differently. Very, very rich. I think we might have time for one last question. Christy, is there one that's bubbling and particularly relevant?
I was just saying to myself that there are so many questions coming in. These are wonderful, and I'm going to try and find a way to bring all of these questions forward to John and Walter and Peter, and I appreciate all of the questions that are coming in. One that seems to be recurring from a number of people is the idea of how does this happen in an incremental way that, you know, doesn't necessarily cause a revolution, or how do you see that playing out in small groups? And the other is, like, are there any places, examples where you can see the another kingdom happening now?
Well, the last one is simple. Just look at the work that Tamarack does. You know, I think as evidence, there is a revolution or taking place. It's just not visible. I don't think it's a question of being violent or abrupt. It's just that there's a cooperative economy that exists in North America and other places, and it's taking place everywhere. It's just that nobody calls it news. It's called human interest. And so this economy of interdependence, neighborliness, co-housing, co-production, everything, time banking. I mean, there's a lot of people writing about it. Tamarack is a leader in this. Schumacher. It's just it goes unseen. And so I think the revolution will come, or the movement will come, as we say in the book, when what's existing just gets, there's an event that recognizes it. Because the market system just isn't working, and it's not working for most people. It's just that most of the people complain about the income inequality want to blame the rich. They don't blame their own way of thinking about relationships, market, neighbors, and things like that.
Well, thank you, all three of you. I think for me, the big thing I'm taking away from our conversation on this webinar is, you know, how powerful one's story is, and how the story we hold helps shape our actions and also ultimately helps to create the culture that we are living in. And I think one of the real gifts that Another Kingdom offers to all of us is this opportunity to consider perhaps a new story, a different story, and to be mindful of, you know, what would happen if I just change how I think about things. I may go about doing the same things, but I would do it with a completely different energy and perhaps a different outcome. So thank you, all three of you, for sharing your insights and perspectives. And many thanks to all the folks from all around the world who joined us for the call today. I really do echo Christy's comments that, you know, we're going to do our best to capture the questions and perhaps share them with the three of you for kind of further comments and dialogue. I also really want to take a moment to acknowledge our supporters, Human Resources and Social Development Canada, Maytree Foundation, the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, and the Province of Ontario. Their investments in Tamarack are helping to make these webinars possible. As promised, over the next few days, we will send all of you an email that includes a link to this audio, also some other material related to today's call, and we certainly welcome your feedback always around ideas for future calls or how we can improve the webinars that we are offering. Also, a friendly reminder that this session will be posted in our online library at deepeningcommunity.ca, and that's our website where you'll also find lots of relevant resources and fresh content from our thought leaders and our learning community. We are so excited to be welcoming John McKnight to our upcoming gathering in Edmonton, Alberta for Deepening Community. It's our national gathering, Resilient Neighborhoods, When People Care, Edmonton, Alberta, June 7th to 9th. Any of you who are on the call, if you haven't yet registered, we would love to have you join us there as well. And also just wanted to tell you our next webinar is coming up in May with Michael McAfee from Promise Neighborhoods, and he's going to share with us the experience of this collective impact initiative and its the changes that it's helping to be a catalyst for in neighborhoods. We also have 2 excellent learning series underway, both of which are free. One is a closer look at this notion of social resiliency. Our host is Milton Friesen. And the second one is our Communities of Belonging series being hosted by our thought leader, Michael Jones. So on our event page, you can find much more about those and how you can be part of them. So finally, we do have lots of other exciting events coming up at Tamarack, and we really encourage you to visit the Tamarack main website, tamarackcommunity.ca, so you can learn more and sign up for our monthly e-newsletter, Engage, because that's another way that you can get updated on what's going on. So thanks, everyone, for fantastic dialogue. I only wish it could be longer, and look forward to this dialogue continuing in the future. Thanks, everyone. Have a super day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, 3. Bye-bye.
All right.